Hi, I'm Lisa Sanfilippo, and welcome to the Sleep Recovery Talk for the Health Flix Global Wellness Community. It is a pleasure to have you here. I see we've got quite a few of you logged on. And today we're going to be talking about our sleeplessness as a collective wake-up call. It's very interesting because we've entered this state of, global pandemic, and many of our communities are on what we're calling lockdown. And those words, pandemic and lockdown, they're very frightening. And one of the things that we know is that when we feel frightened and when we feel under threat, that our sleep tends to suffer. And at this very moment in time, the thing that we need most is resilience. And we need our immune systems to be strong. And we need our emotional and psychological resilience to keep pace with real changes in our lives as a result of maybe not going out to work, maybe suffering from income loss, and a whole range of other things that are happening to us right now, even in addition to the looming specter of coming down with an illness. So there are a lot of things that are happening right now, and sleep is more important than ever. And now what we also know is that in the general scope of things, even prior to the COVID-19 outbreaks, half of us at any given time will be having trouble with our sleep. Maybe not clinically defined insomnia, but the industry that sells us things to do with our sleep has burgeoned in the last certainly 5 years. And about 15 years ago, I began doing yoga for sleep and insomnia workshops here in London because I was asked to do that. Because I had an area of specialism around that, having recovered from my own really substantial insomnia over a long period of time. And at that point, very few people were really talking about their problems with sleep. And I think it's either that we're talking about it more or that it's gotten worse. And that's even prior to these pandemic and lockdown situations. So it just exacerbates some of the problems around sleep for many of us, not necessarily for everybody. And we can at this time possibly, because there are some real changes in our habits and changes in our circumstances, we can possibly use this time as an opportunity to shift some of our patterns around sleep, the unhealthy patterns that we may have gotten ourselves into around sleep. We can look at shifting those during this time if we collectively amp down out of an over agitated state, if we can manage our nervous systems, if we can manage any looming anxiety and actually take a holistic approach, we can find ourselves coming out of this stronger than ever. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation, and it's just to give us some visuals. There's not a lot of text in it, but what I would like to ask is that as you're participating, I think if you have any questions, I love going from questions rather than just going straight through a presentation, because I think it adds a real flavor. So if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, and I'd be very happy to respond to them. You can raise a hand, and we'll take it from there. So we have about 45 minutes together, maybe a little bit less than that right now. So do feel free to ask questions. Oh, by the way, my name is Lisa Sanfilippo, and I've been a yoga teacher for 20 years and a yoga therapist and a psychotherapist. So a lot of what I'm talking to you about today is going to be coming from the perspective of a therapeutic approach to yoga, not the jumpy aroundy kind of yoga, but a kind of yoga that takes us deep into our body sense and that is reparative to us. And hopefully is accessible for absolutely everyone. You don't have to be into yoga or a yoga person in order to benefit from the discussion today. So this is hopefully something that you can share with the non-yoga people in your life if you are a yoga person. The other thing is that everything that I'm about to talk to you about can be found in two books. One, I don't know if this will be backwards, it might be backwards on your video, but it's called Sleep Recovery, and it was published this year by Bloomsbury, which is the publisher that published all the Harry Potter books. So Sleep Recovery is the one for the general public, and everything I talk about here is backed up in this book and cited and researched. And this book here, for those of you that are more technically minded, is called Yoga Therapy for Insomnia and Sleep Recovery. And this is for health practitioners, doctors, nurses, yoga teachers, massage therapists, psychotherapists. And it's also been published in Italian. And the practices that I'm going to make mention of, if you would like to use the practices that I'm mentioning, I'm going to type in the comments, movement for modern life. And everyone who's on this call or seeing this video can access the physical practices of breath and stretching and some of the self-acupressure points that I'm going to mention on Movement for Modern Life. And there's a 2-week free trial. So you're actually going to get some instruction in these practices there that you can really use to support your sleep. So I'm going to give us a general overview. And if you put in, the code is Lisa20, you'll get access to those practices for 2 weeks. And that's actually enough to embed those practices into your life. So if I teach them to you and you learn them, you'll have them always. Okay, so I'm just going to have a look at some questions here. Waking up in the middle of the night and finding it difficult to get back to sleep. I'm going to put a pin in that. That's a lot about nervous system hyperarousal and possibly just being a little bit heightened even before bed. And we'll talk about how the sleep sequence can help. Perimenopause, noticing more insomnia. Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a hormonal component. The body temperature tends to raise and our sleep will tend to suffer. I'm not going to necessarily talk about that in as much detail today because we're going to focus on sleep in the COVID-19 world, whereas I'm doing some work with Petra Cavini on menopause yoga, where we're going to focus on menopause, perimenopause, and sleep. But to the extent that I can cover that a little bit and its relationship to the nervous system, I will touch upon that. So thank you, Liz, for the question. Okay, so welcome to those of you who are just joining us. I'm going to give us a little presentation and I'm going to see if I can share my screen with you. So just bear with me for 1 minute. And if you have specific questions and things that you'd like to get out of today's session, pop them in the chat box here. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And here we go. All right. Getting ready. You're going to see me making frowny faces at you for just a moment while I find things on my screen. Okay, great. So there we go. Screen share. Can you see it? I think you can. Okay, so the main thing is that we often have unrealistic expectations of our sleep. I'm looking at a comment. Okay, we often have, overthinking. We often have this idea that we should have an 8-hour uninterrupted block of sleep. And whereas that's great for some people, it's not necessarily what has been happening over the course of human evolution. Very often there would be a block of sleep that would take place when we would first find darkness, right? The brain and the body are cued up to produce melatonin when it starts getting dark, right? And often we override when the body tells us, oh, you're tired, you should go to sleep. And we think, oh, it's only 8 o'clock, I shouldn't go to sleep now. And we go to sleep at 10, and then we find ourselves awake after a short period of time. And we might compress our sleep into a very short space of time and wonder why we don't feel refreshed. So some people will have something called biphasic sleep, where they go to sleep, they wake up for a little while, and then they go back to sleep. I'm going to show you the sleep cycle in a few slides, and I'll give you some hints and tips about how we can manage the difference between the beginning of our sleep and the end of our sleep, when the actual substance and the tone and the purpose of sleep changes over the course of the night. So one of the things that we'll do is we'll learn how to manage our sleepy feelings and our wakeful feelings throughout the day, rather than just compressing all rest into a single 8-hour time block. And we'll also learn how not to remove the hunger for sleep, remove the sleep appetite by doing restful things too late at night. That's a kind of paradoxical thing. If you're into yoga or meditation, getting something that's really deeply restful right before sleep could actually be interfering with your ability to get to sleep and stay asleep. So we'll come on to that in a moment too. Okay, what we expect. I'm going to just check what's going on. What happens? Well, when we compress our sleep and when we constantly keep ourselves awake throughout the day, and alert throughout the day. And many of us are working from home during this pandemic, if we're still working, and there's a laser focus on the screen, and often we're quite hunched forward, and we may not take the breaks that we need, and we may not have the buffer that we would normally have from commuting at the start of the day and at the end of the day. We may not have the scenery change, the clothing change, and all of those things that we need to signify to us it's the beginning of the day, it's the middle of the day, it's the end of the day. And we could end up really exhausting ourselves by trying to have a high level of intensity. Now, if you're working from home and you're staring at a screen, that's one thing. If you're not used to working from home and having your kids at home, that can compound the issue. So what we need to do in order to sleep well is to find a way to manage all of the things that are happening on really every level. And I'll talk about the 5 levels at which we work with our sleep, and find a new pattern that's going to be more constructive and helpful to us. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're trying to potentially, some of us might have less to do, and some of us might be doing all of the things, depending on whether we're, quote, in lockdown alone, with our kids, with our partners. It might be putting stress on relationships. We might be actually enjoying ourselves in lockdown. Any number of things can be occurring, but there's a lot that's happening that's changing our relationship, not just to our daily habits, but to our sleep. Okay, one of the things that we're going to talk about is not overriding our sleeplessness. So one of the things that will happen chemically in the brain when we're tired, a neurotransmitter called adenosine builds up, right? And often what we do is when we have caffeine, we have a little cup of tea or coffee in the afternoon, it removes the adenosine and it tricks your brain into thinking that you're not tired. Right? Because instead of the adenosine going into those little spaces where it binds in the brain, the caffeine elbows in and says, no, you're not tired. And so you override the sleepy cues, right? The cues that say, take a rest. And when we rest, that's when we decrease the adenosine and a number of other neurotransmitters that tell us that we're sleepy. So if we exercise or take caffeine or have sugar or any number of other stimulants, then we override our sleeplessness. So one of the things that we have the ability possibly to do during this lockdown time is to rebuild our capacity for what's called interoception, the ability to sense inwardly things like hunger, thirst, feeling elevated or feeling lethargic. And instead of overriding what's happening in the body, what's happening emotionally and on a number of other levels, we can learn to respond to ourselves more compassionately and more, I'll say, successfully or effectively. And that can actually help us to repair our ability to sleep better in the long term, if we can manage the potential anxiety and manage the challenge and change of this time. So often when we're tired, we're still agitated and wired. And if you're looking at the news a lot, or if you're living with people who are very anxious or frustrated, or taking any number of the emotional routes that we would all take through this time, you might find that you're both tired and wired at the same time. And the issues around sleep are not just taking place now. They are inherent in our society. And as I said before, almost half of us are having trouble sleeping at any given moment. And what we do know as well is that, I'm going to go back here, it tends to be a little bit worse for women, because if you look at all of the things that are associated with being biologically female, menstrual cycles, pregnancy, childbirth, perimenopause, and menopause, those things tend to spike and drop the hormones. And when the body has more heat, right, having heat in the body late at night is something that runs counter to the cues to go to sleep. So as we move towards sleep time, the core body temperature will drop. And when the core body temperature isn't dropping low enough, it's very hard for the human body to receive the sleep cues. A whole range of things are taking place with hormonal imbalances. And then when we add stress to the mix and anxiety to the mix, it tends to make matters a little bit worse. Okay, so What we also know is that the things that we're experiencing on a personal level mirror what's happening on a global level. So when I first began practicing yoga to deal with my own insomnia, I thought I was the only person awake at 4 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. And we weren't really talking about insomnia. There were only a couple of books that I can find. Now there are lots of videos on YouTube and everybody's talking about their sleep. And it's partly because we're talking about it more. We're more open about our issues of sleep. And it's partly because we're more hyper vigilant, agitated, and more pressed and rushed than we ever have been, probably in all of human history. So we need certain brainwave patterns, synchronous, slow brainwave patterns, in order to not just switch from on to off, but to slow down and move into the state that prepares us for sleep. But very few of us are actually doing that on a regular basis, right? If you have a yoga practice, if you're a meditator, then you are among the few that are actually doing this. But globally, we're seeing this kind of hyperactive response to everything, and it's having its effect on us. What we have the opportunity to do, if we're not part of emergency services or essential services, is to actually slow everything down. Being under lockdown, we could view as shelter in place. We could view it as rest at home. We could view it as not having to move around so much. And we can take this as a time. I'm hearing more birds outside my window. The air is cleaner where I live. And I'm noticing that I'm able to respond to my environment with a little bit more mindfulness than I was when I was rushing around and fulfilling obligations outside of the home. So this is really an opportunity. Our sleeplessness or our desire to sleep better can be a real wake up call. We can use this time and use all of the tools that we have to help us sleep better. Now, we know that when we go into stress and anxiety, I know that if I look at the news too much, I feel my heart rate increase. I feel my face tighten. I feel my thoughts speed up and become more anxious. And that takes us into the sympathetic nervous system response of fearful protection. And that's really the opposite of where you want to be in order to help you sleep better. Now, of course, we need some of the near end of the sympathetic nervous system, which is not fight or flight, but is having a sense of activation. I need to be a little bit sympathetic nervous system in order to be alert enough to speak to you here on this talk. But if I were to rest back like this, we take a breath together, we enter a more parasympathetic state. And at the very far end of that spectrum is rest and digest, right? Hormonal repair, immune building, putting energy back on the grid, and helping the body to replenish itself, right? So we need to actually get enough time in the parasympathetic nervous system, and in some senses, almost to fundamentally retrain ourselves in how to be in those parasympathetic states. Many of you will be acquainted with a book by Herbert Benson called The Relaxation Response, in which it talks about getting into the state and all of the neurophysiological changes that occur. So yoga, meditation, and conscious action on our parts can really help us to come out of fight or flight and recondition our ability to rest while we do have this kind of crack in everything that can let the light in. So another important thing that's changed for a lot of people is that their daily cycles have changed, right? If you look at your day pre-lockdown and now, you might have a little bit more flexibility. I just gave a seminar to a company where there was a woman who brought up questions. She said, I normally commute for an hour each day into work and an hour each day after work, and I'm finding I'm going to sleep later and I'm waking up later and I'm not having such good quality sleep. And so she's got her whole time clock changed by not commuting. The buffer that she once had in her day is no longer there. So the advice is to find things that help you to feel activated and alert and awake at the times when you need it, and then to slowly amp down towards the end of the day as it starts to get darker. And when you have the activation at certain times of day, make use of it by doing things like having in Britain, we're allowed to have a kind of daily exercise period, making sure that you're getting enough vigorous exercise while it's bright out. even dancing around your home with your earphones on, getting the heart rate up during the daytime, and then starting to put energy back on the grid if you find yourself emotionally or physically exhausted by having a legs up the chair rest. I'll show that to you possibly before the end of the talk. We'll do a few practical things together. Okay, I want to also emphasize the sleep cycle. This is really important for us to know about, that in the first part of the night of the sleep episode, your body will naturally go into non-REM sleep, which is, it has been referred to as the dead sleep, but I refer to it as deep body sleep, right? And towards the end of the night, the more sleep cycles of 60 to 90 minutes you've had, the more you get into the REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement when you're dreaming and you're reorganizing thoughts and building up emotional resilience, and you're reorganizing your memories. There's a lot that takes place in the brain, can be referred to as cleansing in part of the brain. Don't want to get into it in too much detail, but what's really important for us to understand is that if we have a high level of agitation and arousal in the nervous system, what will tend to happen is we'll be so tired and we'll go to sleep. And then after 1 or 2, maybe even 3 of these sleep cycles, so somewhere between 2 and 4 hours later, boom, we come back up towards the twilight of sleep. Maybe we hear a noise, maybe we have a thought, the heart rate comes up, and then we're awake. Now, what do we do if we wake up in the middle of the night? This is where, number one, if you practice something like the simple sleep sequence that I've created before you go to sleep, there's less overall tension in your physical body, and you're more likely to stay asleep for longer and sleep through the night. And I've done this. I have to do some very specific research. I'm a researcher by training, but I've done anecdotal research over the last 10 years, 15 years. And the people who do the sleep sequence that I give them with this dropping in slow rhythmic breath, they find that their sleep duration increases and they don't get those wake ups in the middle of the night. The second thing is, if you do wake up in the middle of the night, rather than going into the agitated brainwave pattern of watching something on Netflix or doing something that requires intense thought, it can be helpful to do this, pulling the physical tension out of your body and rhythmic breathing, so that you then slip back into sleep and then end up having maybe 1 or even 2 sleep cycles in which you dream. Right? Often for me, if I'm having a difficult time, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and make sure that I do something to calm the nervous system, soothe the breath, and then get even that little tail end of sleep, so that the mental and the emotional and psychological resilience are there. That's a really important part. Also, if you're not getting enough sleep at night because you're anxious or stressed, meditation fulfills some of that brain reorganizing function. And it can be very, very helpful to get your meditation in the morning. And then in the afternoon, when you start to feel the slump coming on, rather than right before bed. You can use a short meditation right before bed to help you to calm the nervous system and slow the brainwave patterns. But if you end up doing too much restorative right before bed, it will actually act like having a big snack before a meal. It will remove the drive to sleep deeply. So as we come into this time together, it's really important that we look at not just the physical, but the energetic, the mental, the emotional, and even the soulful aspects of our sleep. And that's how we can use this as a wake-up call. Also, in sleep recovery, I'm not going to get into this too much today, but Ayurvedically speaking, and in terms of personalities and body types, some people will tend to have a light, airy sleep and be very much interrupted in their sleep even before this global pandemic and lockdown. Monkey types, the Ayurvedic Vata types, some people will tend to have a much deeper and faster sleep. We call them tiger types, the Ayurvedic Pitta. And then some that will tend to sleep for a long period of time. And when they go out of balance, their sleep tends to not feel as restorative, even though they're sleeping a long period of time. So it's really important for you to understand, when you're in good balance, what your individual sleep looks like, how much you need, not just to conform to a standard, but how much you need to actually feel good in yourself. Now, physically, the simple sleep sequence that I've created, it's a really simple way of pulling the tension out of your body. And rather than doing that practice here on this video, there is access to it on Movement for Modern Life. And you can practice that on your own when you're lying down on your floor. Okay, the next thing is putting energy back on the grid. So if you, after this talk, even if you're going to do another talk, lie down on the floor, put your shins up on your sofa, and take a few deep breaths. And do that for 10 minutes when the need to rest arises. What you'll actually do is repair the interoceptive response. Oh, I'm sleepy or I'm tired. I'm going to give myself a little bit of rest. And that actually decreases the adenosine buildup in your body and reminds you that when you have the cue to rest, that's how to do it. The next point that I'd like to make is really about how we manage our minds. So one of the things that I think some of you have said is that you can't switch off your mind, right? So what happens often if you don't give yourself what I call mental digestion time and physical rest during the day is that you put your body in the bed and every thought that has not been digested, important or unimportant, will come marching in like, a marching band, just playing every tune you could possibly imagine. So one of the things that's very helpful is to very simply take out a piece of paper and do a brain dump. Some people call it the captain's log. But to just get the thoughts down out of the mind, draw them down, put them on paper, and that slows down the process of catastrophizing and lets us see logically and takes us out of the fear center in the brain and into the neocortex and lets us actually slow down. I do this by hand rather than on a computer so that it slows everything down. Really helpful for a lot of people at the end of a work day or at the end of a day. Meditation brings you into the different brainwave patterns that you need for mental, emotional, as well as physical resilience. It's good to put the computer to the side. I'm not a massive fan of apps. I'm a massive fan of doing it with a sense of togetherness and containment and just giving ourselves the ability to rely on an internal source. What we can do is we can come to the simple awareness of the breath in the nose without trying to control the breath, or we can use a mantra. All of this is detailed in sleep recovery, but it's really important that we get this in the morning and in the afternoon, that we keep a container of the same amount of time each day so that the mind and the body entrain to this containing. Got a few minutes left. There are a couple more things that I wanted to raise here about our sleep during this particular time, and then we'll have some time for questions. It's a bit fuzzy, this slide here, but I want to give credit to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And now there are some different varieties of thinking about the stages of grief, and also during this time, not linear. Our emotional responses to what's happening around us are not linear. We don't just go through one path. But Kubler-Ross talked about the stages of grief, and then we can put in some other things as well. So when we first found out that we were going into lockdown, a lot of us were experiencing a form of shock or even denial, right? And so if we've had any trauma in our lives before this point, that can be called back up, and our responses can be anything from denial and shutdown to anger, frustration, bargaining, trying to find ways around things, depression. I know a lot of people have felt just overwhelming waves of sadness. And then after that sadness, maybe there's a sense of acceptance. And what will tend to happen is that you might be in one of these places. You might be feeling really angry or frustrated, and somebody around you might be in a state of acceptance and just fine, or maybe go into denial, or maybe go into anger. So we're all going to be in different places at different times. Now, having been in lockdown for 2 weeks, those of us here in London, many of us are kind of settling in a little bit, and some of us are actually feeling more stressed than ever. So it really is time for us to acknowledge where we are in this cycle and give scope and space to those around us, and be able to use our tools, whether it's nonviolent communication or recognizing where we are in the drama triangle that psychologists in the transactional analysis field will talk about, but really drawing upon our therapists, drawing upon our emotional and psychological and relationship management tools at this time, incredibly powerful. And when we take that tension out, I know that when my personal relationships feel more peaceful, I sleep so much more easily. And this is a very important part of repairing our sleep at this time. Now we know anger, sadness, fear, all of the emotions at the same time. We need to deal with all of those. The other piece that we have an opportunity to focus on at this point is our spiritual and soulful selves coming, into a question mark about, our work, our livelihoods, what we actually need, what we no longer need. Some people that I've been talking to are really relishing the simplicity of not feeling like they're missing out on anything and turning back to the people that they're in lockdown with or the environment that they're in, quote, lockdown with, and not seeing it so much as a prison, but seeing it as a way of turning back to what's essential. And I don't mean to paint a rose-tinted gloss onto it, but at the same time, we always have a choice, right? Anxiety and fear are natural responses, but how do we dig deep at this time? If you've ever practiced anything, whether it's sports training or meditation or yoga or any sort of spiritual or religious practice, how do you find that, take it off the shelf and put it into practice? All of those times when you used that stuff in the past was really a dress rehearsal for the times when we're going to be the most activated and the most stressed. And when we bring those things back in, we calm and quell our nervous systems. We come back to our resources. And that has a deep effect on our ability to trust that we will find a way and we will be mostly okay. Right? So can we use this time for inquiry? Can we use it for digging deep? And then hopefully we can wake up happier collectively. So the 5 steps in sleep recovery are found here. And the main things are repairing your physical connection to your sleep, your ability to put energy back on the grid when you need it, and to sense what your agitation or relaxation response is. The third is working with the mind. The fourth is dealing with the emotions. And what's interesting is that right now we're kind of collectively going through something together. So it's even more acceptable to talk about what we're feeling and to get it out and to work through it together. And then really taking this opportunity to reconnect on a very deep level to what's valuable and important about being alive as human beings. Right? We're seeing more compassion and more collective feeling than we have for a long time. So that's my presentation for you. I'm going to unshare my screen. Okay, and I'm going to take some more questions. I see that there are at least 40 of you, maybe even more, and I've got 8 questions here. Am I suggesting no caffeine or no caffeine beyond a certain time of the day? Okay, that's a really important thing. I don't mind caffeine. It depends on what effect it has on you and on your nervous system. But know this is a really important fact, that caffeine has a half-life of about 4 hours. So that means it takes about 4 hours, give or take a little bit, depending on your metabolism, it takes about 4 hours to get out of your system, half of it. So if you're having a double espresso at 4 p.m., at 8 p.m., it's like you've still got an espresso running around. And then at midnight, it's like you've still got half of an espresso in your system. And then at 4 in the morning, you have a quarter of an espresso still in your system. Now, I wouldn't have an espresso at 8 p.m. and I wouldn't have a half of an espresso at night. There are some people, I know some people, they can have a caffeine, they can have a coffee, a double espresso at 9 o'clock at night, and by 11 o'clock, go to sleep through the night, no problem. For those people, fantastic. But not everybody has that ability. And I find that if I even look at a cup of coffee after 2 p.m., I actually can't get to sleep. So it really depends on your response to those substances. The other thing that many people will be relying upon right now is alcohol. And what that tends to do is it affects your body temperature. It spikes your body temperature, which makes it harder for you to get to sleep. And it plays around with your neurochemistry. It spikes a neurochemical called GABA, which takes your anxiety and melts it away temporarily. But when your brain says, oh, we've got plenty of this GABA we don't need to make anymore. There's a gap in it. So there are a range of things that are happening. And the best thing we can do is to try to manage our stress with exercise, good nutrition, diet, and things like meditation and yoga. So for those of you who've joined a little bit later, I've made a number of suggestions. They're all going to be available on YouTube. They're all going to be available on the recorded version of this talk. And you can go to Movement for Modern Life, I think it's .com, and you'll be able to get for 14 days all of the sleep recovery practices that I'm mentioning that are physical, the asana practices and the meditation, and some marma point therapy that helps you to de-stress the nervous system. And if you put in Lisa 20, if you want to continue your membership, you'll get that. Okay, so yoga nidra versus sleep. What are the pros and cons? One of the things that I'm very careful to explain is that in the way that I approach sleep recovery, I want you to be able to do things that are endogenous, that you can give to yourself. Yoga nidra is beautiful, but it's also guided by someone else most often. And it's normally done on a recording. And for people who've experienced trauma, it's very difficult to listen to someone else tell them what to do with their minds while they're relaxing their bodies. That's one thing. Another piece of it is that everything I teach in terms of the sleep recovery practices are things that you can remember and do for yourself at any time with no apps, no potions, no pills, no recordings, nothing that needs batteries, nothing that needs to be plugged in. So yoga nidra is wonderful, but for some people, it's not going to be their first port of call. It might be something that they can rely on for a bit of relaxation during the day or to help them get to sleep. But I would love to help us not need anything. Nice to have it, but not need anything to do this very natural process of going to sleep. And that's why I call it sleep recovery. It's repairing our natural ability to rest endogenously within ourselves without relying on someone else to give us something. And that's a revolutionary thing because it means that you're not buying something and you're not clicking on something and you're not having to go anywhere outside of yourself. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple more questions here. Can you get a copy of the recording? Is that on YouTube? I think, Joe, that it is. Thank you for that question. I'm often really tired after a full night's sleep. I sleep without waking, but I'm tired when I do wake in the morning. What is this about? I don't know, Tammy, what it's about because I don't know you, but what could be happening are one of two things. One is if you're eating too late, you might be trying to digest your meal while you're sleeping, and that can interfere with your sleep quality. Actually, I'll give you three things. Another thing is that your breathing might be suboptimal. So sometimes if there's sleep apnea or if there's a difficulty sleeping, the body will kind of tend to wake itself up a little bit without us recognizing it throughout the night, and we might have less restorative sleep. Another thing might be a need for more activating exercise in the early part of the day to help create that difference between wakefulness and sleepiness so that your body rests more deeply at night. So Tammy, I hope that answered your question. I've answered Lisa's question about yoga nidra. Catching up with the notes from her first, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Philippa. And caffeine. Okay, so any other questions before we just bring it to a close? Okay, what would you disturbed by your partner's sleep? That's a great question. If you're disturbed by your partner's sleep, depends on what it is. I don't know. This is some old school stuff. But my grandparents actually had two separate twin beds in the same bedroom, and then when they wanted to be together, they put the beds together and then they put them apart. So earplugs and having different blankets and things like that can be helpful. I would say, as a possible solution, if people are able to do the sleep sequence together at night, that can be very helpful for calming the nervous system and everybody sleeps a little bit better. But basically, if it's your partner's sleep that is suffering and you're suffering as a result, if you have another room to sleep in, that might be a possibility. I'm sure you've thought of all of that stuff. I'm seeing some more questions. I often work out issues by writing them. Any other tips? So writing, meditating, and a range of other things. I'm going to say to the 3 a.m. wake people, doing the pulling the tension out of the body, doing the marma points that you'll find in the Movement for Modern Life sleep recovery set of practices. Those are incredibly helpful. So not just working with the mind, but working with the body and working with the breath. For those that have restless legs, I've had some success with the part of the simple sleep sequence that deals with stretching the hamstrings, opening the outer hips and the adductors. So also activating the legs by pressing into things can be very helpful for working with restless legs. But there can be a mineral or vitamin deficiency that leads to restless legs. So that's an important time to check with your healthcare professional. So we're going to have to draw to a close in about 5 minutes. I'm just having a look here at some of the comments. Shamila, you've asked, when I try meditating in the morning, I find myself falling asleep. Is there any way around this? Okay, if you are falling asleep during your meditation in the morning, it is because you are tired. Take the rest that your meditation is offering you. That's your body doing one of two things when you meditate. You're either getting deep rest if you feel like you're falling asleep. Good, get that rest. Okay, if you're not actually lying down, but you're sitting up in your meditation, that's fine. You're not actually impairing your sleep or harming your sleep in any way. So maybe get 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon. And if you find yourself falling asleep, fine, your body is tired. If you find yourself having a very agitated state during your meditation, also fine, also good. That's your brain kind of digesting and processing and reorganizing and purifying. So don't worry too much about what's happening in your meditation. Stick with either your mantra or your simple anapana technique and work with it in that way. How can sleep sabotage be dealt with? This is a great question. Okay, winding down in the evening, I feel I can't be bothered. Okay, I'm going to give you a glib response here, but that's something to take to a qualified counselor or psychotherapist. It's also something where here's an answer that you can do for yourself. What needs do I have that I'm trying to meet in other ways? Okay, so if your need is for connection, if your need is for mental stimulation, if your need is for comfort, find a way to meet those needs during the day and give them to yourself. So if you're doing things like either drinking alcohol or watching Netflix or, smoking pot or whatever it is that you're doing instead of going to bed, look at when you can meet the same needs in a more healthful and sleep supporting way. That's a really, really short answer. Are naps a good idea? Very short naps can be helpful, but longer naps will interfere with your ability to sleep well, unless you're unwell. If you're sick, if you get the virus, if you get any other kind of illness, take naps, absolutely. But otherwise, legs up the chair pose or meditation, about 20 minutes. That's what I recommend. Not very long stretches of restorative during the day, but shorter periods of time where you're putting energy back on the grid, but you're not removing the sleep drive, tends to have a much better effect. So the 2-week program that I mentioned is on Movement for Modern Life. It's not a 2-week program on Movement, but you get 2 weeks of the sleep recovery and a range of other videos for free. Movement for Modern Life, and you put in Lisa 20, and you can get the practices there. That's a giveaway. The other thing is that the book Sleep Recovery, it's actually not particularly expensive, and you can get it on Kindle and you can get it on Audible as well. And it goes through the sleep sequence. It goes through all of the reasons why certain habits are more helpful for your sleep. And it gives you the quiz to find out what your sleep type is and helps you to focus. Now, the other thing that's really important that is so timely right now is in chapter 4, I'm talking about post-traumatic insomnia and the things that you may be experiencing as a result of the things going on in the news or fear. I go outside of my home and I'm worried about like touching the door handle for fear of getting a virus. That kind of hypervigilance is what we need to talk about in terms of our sleep in this chapter around the emotional aspect of sleep and post-traumatic insomnia, right? So you're going to find a lot of the restorative practices are in here for the middle of the day or mopping up after a difficult night's sleep, and new parents rescue kit, and also, breathing the baby down, the stuff about your nervous system and how it relates to sleep. And if you happen to be a yoga teacher or a health professional, this is the more detailed and more referenced version. And lots of credit to Heather Mason at the Minded Institute for her contributions to this when we were working together. And those of you who are interested in sleep and insomnia, Yoga for Mental Health has a chapter that I co-authored with Satbir Khalsa on insomnia. I think it's chapter 5. Yep, chapter 5 on insomnia, and it goes through a range of interventions, practices, etc. So it has been so great to have you all here. Thank you for your comments. I haven't been able to address them all, but if you want to grab the book and if you want to stay in touch, let me know. Those of you who are yoga teachers or health professionals, I do teach a multi-day continuing professional development that helps you to help other people with sleep recovery. And most of the people who take that professional development course as qualified professionals, they find that their sleep improves as well as their ability to help other people with their sleep. So it's a case of physician heal thyself, and to take this opportunity to allow ourselves to sleep better and to fundamentally reorganize our relationships to our bodies, our energy, our minds, our emotions, and our soulful selves is going to be really helpful. I see a couple of raised hands, which I wasn't able to get to, but I hope everybody has asked their questions, and it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much to HealthFlix and all of the people organizing it, to Michelle for hosting us. And you can find me at Lisa Yoga London on Instagram, Lisa Yoga London online, and sleep_recovery on Instagram, sleep-recovery.com. So I hope to see you all again and to help you to find a deeper sleep and to feel more awake during the day. Lots of love, and see you soon. Bye for now.